Thank you, Professor Sinha. I will discuss about transport and carbon emission. Transport is very important sector as far as carbon dioxide emission is concerned. There are two sectors, transport and power, which are going to contribute highest as far as incremental change in carbon dioxide emission is concerned. Fortunately, for power sector, we have technology solution available. Rather than producing electricity from coal or gas, you can produce electricity from water or nuclear energy source. But for transport, there is a serious problem because technology solutions are not really available where you could provide mobility to the people by having a mechanism which is not going to contribute to carbon dioxide emission. You might have seen the cases where developed countries blame China and India for all the problems, starting from crude oil price to problem of climate change, which is going to happen. The reason is very simple. India and China are the two largest growing economies. And all the incremental change which you are going to have in these two sectors, transport and power, would come from India and China. So for example, Indian electricity consumption is hardly 600 units per year per capita, per person. European consumes around 6,000 units per year per capita. So we are hardly consuming 10% of electricity what Europeans consume. American consumes far more than that. Now, it is inevitable that you are going to increase your energy consumption, electricity consumption, as you move on economic growth prospect. As far as transport is concerned, people require mobility. As economies progress, without mobility, without electricity consumption, you cannot really move forward. So people, as well as goods and services in your economy, has to be moved from one place to another place. There are research which says that as far as people's mobility is concerned, people will always move in a day, say, for 70 minutes. So people travel around 70 minutes every day on an average. Now when economy progresses, obviously you use faster mode of travel. So rather than traveling by non-motorized transport mode, you move to motorized transport mode, and within motorized transport mode, faster modes of transport. Mobility in America, US, as far as railroad mobility is concerned, is around 24,000 kilometers per year per person. So every American moves around 24,000 kilometers every year. Every European moves around 12,000 kilometers every year. As far as land-based mobility is concerned, we are not discussing air-based mobility and water-based mobility. Both Europeans and Americans have reached to saturation level of their mobility. As far as passenger mobility is concerned, people's mobility is concerned. So their mobility requirement is not increasing over the years, say during last decade and so. India's mobility is at very low level. I have done research where I try to find out in what way mobility will change by using sigmoid curve models and so on and so forth. So I'm not presenting the result. But obviously India would also reach to a saturation level at some point in time, maybe 2035, 36, or maybe 2040, 41. When you reach to mobility, obviously you have a mobility level where people will travel at certain distance, maybe 12,000 kilometers per year per person. But in the meantime, the kind of mobility you have, you would find that the growth of mobility would be not less than 8% per year. So mobility requirement of people in India would increase at the rate of 8% per year, which is very significant increase. Same thing would happen in power sector as well. So we are not discussing power sector, but as far as transport is concerned, when your mobility requirement is increasing at the rate of 8% per year, even if nothing is changing with the same kind of modes you are using, energy requirement could change very fast. Historically, if you take the data from last 100 years in transport sector, fuel efficiency of vehicles has increased at the rate of 1% per year, not more than that. So fuel efficiency of vehicles in general has increased not more than 1% per year. It means the energy requirement to cater the mobility need would grow at the rate of not less than 7% per year. Now, carbon dioxide emission is directly related to how much fossil fuels you are using. So if you are using fossil fuels at the rate of 7% per year, carbon dioxide emission would also be more or less at the same rate, which is tremendous growth, which is very high growth. When you have a Kyoto Protocol which says that developed countries would mitigate CO2 emission at the level of 1990, and you are saying even to developing countries that don't increase more than at the rate of 2% per year for coming 20-25 years, transport sector in India would contribute to CO2 emission increment at the rate of 7% per year, which is tremendous. Now, this is in best possible scenario. In worst scenario, when people become prosperous because of economic growth and so on and so forth, mobility increase of 8% may lead to even higher increase in CO2 emission. The reason is, when you become rich, well off, you move from smaller vehicles, say motorcycle to car, smaller cars to bigger cars, high occupancy vehicles to low occupancy vehicles. So, if you see the people who are not very well off, you would have a car where 3-4 people will be sitting. Among well-off families, only 1 or 2% will be sitting in the car. So occupancy goes down. So when economic prosperity is increased among people, you may find for the same level of mobility, you require more vehicles, more uses of vehicles, and more consumption of gasoline or diesel, and more emission of carbon dioxide. So it's not that 8% increase in mobility would result only into 7% increase in carbon dioxide emission, maybe even more if you're not very careful. If you see the growth in vehicular population in India, it is in double digit. Over the years, not less than 10% increase is happening every year in vehicular population. This is the time when car growth is higher than two-wheeler growth in the country. So now we have reached a critical level of income where growth in number of cars is higher than growth in number of two-wheelers. It means what? You are moving towards those kind of vehicles for meeting your mobility requirement, which will consume larger amount of fuel and contribute to larger emission of carbon dioxide. It was unthinkable 3 years back that there would be a city in India which would have vehicle ownership rate in excess of 500. There are cities in India where vehicle ownership rate in terms of how many vehicles you have per 1,000 people is in excess of 500. Obviously, 70% of the vehicles are two-wheelers. So it's not comparable to US data or European data where two-wheelers are negligible in number. There are largely cars. In India, you have largely two-wheelers, but over the years things will change. So last 10 years, how vehicular population is changing in different cities. There's a massive increase in number of cities. Even in cities like Kanpur, where in 99 you had 160 vehicles per 1,000 people, now you have 239 vehicles per 1,000 people. Okay, so it means for mobility requirement, people are relying now more on motorized transport, and there are a number of cities where income level is far higher than mofussil areas. The growth in vehicular population is very high. So the kind of scenario you have, you would find that CO2 emission, I'm not going into technical details, but I have done econometric estimation of the mobility requirement and then try to find out how much energy consumption will be and how much CO2 emission will be. You would find that CO2 emission is going to be very high, at the rate of, in best possible scenario, 7% per year, which is tremendous increase. Now, how to tackle this problem? You have to mitigate CO2 emissions from transport sector, because this is the sector which hasn't experienced technological solutions so far, and it's probably highly unlikely that in coming 20, 25 years you will get that. You have to have policy measures which could mitigate CO2 emissions from the sector. So what kind of strategies you could have to reduce carbon dioxide emission from the sector? At broader level, obviously you need to reduce the need for travel for the people. So you could have policy measure which could promote regional economies. So a country like India, you should have economic activity hub centers at different places in the country, so that requirement for movement for the people is minimized. People should not move always, say, from Bihar to Mumbai or to Tamil Nadu. There could be a place like Calcutta, maybe a Delhi or somewhere else, so that the mobility requirement at national level is minimized. If mobility requirement is minimized, obviously, CO2 emissions resulting from that could be reduced. Then you could promote cities of short distances. There could be cities which should be self-sufficient, and make sure that the development of city is such that people don't have to move from one place to another place. Like in Mumbai, you might find everybody is moving towards South Mumbai. That is not the best way of developing cities, because you are increasing the mobility requirement for people. Remember, as far as carbon dioxide emission is concerned, there is not great benefit available even if you have electric train. The reason is electricity in India is largely produced by coal-based power plants, and that actually emits a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. So you must develop cities of short distance. India has advantage in some way. We are the least urbanized country in the world, and we will be less urbanized than many, many poor countries. 1/3 of the people live in urban cities, in cities. World average has already passed, 50% mark. Now, but we would be urbanized. The urbanization process would continue. The process is slow in India, but it is inevitable that in coming years people would move towards cities. So very soon, within 20, 25 years, 30 years, you would add up to that many people which are already existing in cities to new cities. So you have advantage to develop cities which could be of short distances. If you cannot manage the existing cities, but in coming years, because you're going to add not less than that many people in new cities, you could plan in such a way that city is a kind of short distance, not long distance. Because idea is to provide mobility to meet the requirement of the people. Obviously, you have to focus on public transport. Without focusing on public transport, it is very difficult. If you compare Europe versus US, the only difference in transport characteristics is that Europe relies very heavily on public transport. American so. And the best thing which happened in India recently was through Jawaharlal Nehru's urban renewal mission. A lot of cities, particularly, which were not having public transport system, bus transport system, fortunately got through Jawaharlal Nehru urban renewal mission. Cities like Lucknow or Kanpur or Jaipur, they were not having any kind of public transport system. But public transport system is important because the external cost in terms of emission of local pollutants and global pollutants like carbon dioxide is far lower if you compare per passenger kilometer travel by the people. Obviously, you have to promote a rail-based mass transport system if city is large enough. And now, government is planning to have mass transport system in all the cities which have population more than 2 million, which is very promising. So you have to have policy measures which will promote public transport. Policy measures so far, unfortunately, hasn't been supportive to public transport system. If you see fiscal policy, for example, you will find that buses in this country pays very high tax. Every bus operated in this country pays not less than 100,000 rupees every year as a tax, different kinds of tax. It could be motor vehicle tax, it could be passenger tax, and so on and so forth. So something which you would like to promote, why to penalize that? Because charging high tax on public transport system would make it less financially viable. It is already less financially viable in the sense that it finds it difficult to attract passengers who owns vehicle, particularly two-wheelers. You know, operating cost of two-wheeler owner is very low, quite often even lower than the bus fare. Now, that is happening because the pricing and the taxation mechanism which we have is not applicable. Our cars and two-wheelers, if you see, we pay one-time tax, and we don't pay tax in 15 years of age of the vehicle. So this is not the best way to tackle the problem. We must promote public transport. There are cities in Europe, particularly in Germany, where they provide free bus transport services, primarily to promote public transport because they know the benefit to society is far higher. Benefit in terms of less congestion, in terms of less pollution, local pollution, less CO2 emission, and so on. So you must promote bus transport by restructuring tax policies, and obviously restructuring state transport undertakings as well, because they are the main providers of public transport services. I will not go into great detail, but the way publicly owned bus transport services are managed in the country, that is creating a problem. They are highly unproductive. Most of them are financially unviable, and in an environment where subsidies from governments are less likely, they are not able to augment their fleets. They are running fleets which are very old. So in that sense, both quantity as well as quality of service is a problem. And that is happening because restructuring of the state transport undertakings is not difficult. So we need to restructure them. There are transport undertakings, for example, in CSTC in Kolkata. They employ 12 people per operational bus. You don't require 12 people per operational bus. So to employ 12 people, you are basically making sure that your organization is less viable. The revenue, traffic revenue collected by CSTC is hardly enough to pay wages to the people. Forget about maintenance, forget about diesel charges, and so on and so forth. So restructuring is required to make sure that they become viable. There are examples, even within the country. For example, Bangalore Municipal Transport Corporation, BMTC, is a very good example, which is one of the very few organizations in the world which make some surplus profit. So learn from those organizations which are doing well to make sure that you are becoming more and more viable. Integrating different modes of transport is obviously required to promote public transport. During 1982 ACR, we had ring rail constructed in Delhi, and that was highly unutilized. That was rarely used by the people because integration with different modes of transport were lacking. So you need to integrate to promote public transport, and obviously you have to restrain the use of polluting vehicles and fuels. You could use market-based mechanism to restrain that. There is no penalty for very old vehicles, and unfortunately there is no mechanism available to find out how polluting in-use vehicles are in the country. There are mechanisms available, though not very strict, for new vehicles. The vehicles which is sold nowadays have to follow certain norms. Norms are prescribed in terms of Bharat 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth, which is akin to Euro norms. Though we are lagging behind Europe and Japan or American criteria, but we still follow some norms for new vehicles. But 90% of the vehicles in the country are in-use vehicles which are already on the road. For in-use vehicles, unless they are transport vehicles like trucks, taxis, and so on and so forth, for private vehicles, there is no mechanism to really find out whether they are polluting or not. If they are polluting, what kind of penalty they have to pay, and so on and so forth. So we have to use certain mechanisms to restrain the usage of these kind of vehicles by making mandatory, for example, to pay some kind of registration fee once vehicle age is crossing 10 years and so on and so forth. Some kind of mechanism could be adopted to make sure that polluting vehicles are used less and less. You could have demand side management measures. Primarily, once your aim is to make sure that people's mobility requirement is met, but met through a mechanism which is less polluting in nature. So less polluting mechanism would be to focus on mass transport and public transport. More polluting mechanism would be to focus on private vehicles or paratransit modes. So design a mechanism so that though people may buy private vehicles, there's no harm that. In fact, it is desirable that people should buy cars and two-wheelers because it is good for economic development. But make sure that they are using as less as possible. Only in really urgent situation they should use. Otherwise, they should rely more on public transport. How do you do that? You could use certain market-based mechanisms like introduce parking fee everywhere, so that you know that if you are going to this market, you have to pay some penalty. You have to pay 20 rupees, 30 rupees over and above your operating cost, and so on and so forth. You could use fuel tax. Fuel tax is fairly high in a country like India, so there's not much scope available over there, particularly in petrol prices. In diesel prices, you can still do that. As far as petrol prices concerned, we pay as high price as Americans and Japanese pay. So there's a fairly high petrol tax on petrol. Fairly high tax on diesel as well, but not as high as on petrol. So some of the mechanisms which could discourage people to use uses of private vehicles should be adopted, provided you provide alternative to people. Once you provide alternative in terms of decent quality of public transport services, you could implement it. There is a need to improve supply side management measures as well. A lot of pollution happens because of congestion on the road. There are studies which tells you that pollution level increases twofold when your vehicle speed goes down to 10 km/h from say 50 km/h speed. And congestion is happening because of many factors, including supply side constraints. Remove those supply side constraints so that vehicles can run at optimal speed. By allowing vehicle to run at optimal speed, you could serve a lot because you could minimize the pollution emitted by the vehicle significantly. Okay, so there's a need to improve supply constraint as well. Well, promoting car sharing could be another mechanism which may be required, if not now, in coming 5-10 years, where people could get benefit of private vehicle, comfort of private vehicle, at the same time not using so many cars and helping the environment in some ways, encouraging vehicles. Obviously, you have to promote vehicles, particularly in cities. A lot of trips made by private vehicle owners are short distance trip which is not more than 5 km distance. Trip which is not more than 5 km distance can easily be made by non-motorized transport modes, like bicycle. Okay, but you have to have facilities for that. I mean, there is no segregated lane in this country where people can ride bicycle. But because we know that we are going to add as many people as currently living in urban areas in coming 15, 20, 30 years in our cities, develop the cities further in such a way so that you can promote non-motorized transport, if not in existing cities. Okay? So you have luxury in that sense to have the environment in cities, particularly where soil distance level is more likely, to promote non-motorized transport, so that reliance on motorized transport will be minimized. For example, I mean, there is another aspect as far as diesel vehicle is concerned. Nowadays, you might have seen in newspaper that more than 50% of the vehicles sold now are diesel cars, and that's the problem. That's the problem from particularly from suspended particulate matter. Diesel cars pollute city environment very heavily in terms of particulate matter emission, SPM emission. So it's a very bad thing to have so many diesel cars in congested environment. Now, not in many countries you have so much difference in diesel price and petrol price. Even in Pakistan, petrol price is as high, diesel price is as high as petrol price. Because cost of producing petrol and cost of producing diesel is insignificantly different. There's no difference as far as cost of producing petrol is concerned from refineries and cost of producing diesel is concerned. Deliberate difference is made through taxation policies by the government. That was supposed to be supposed to help truckers and supposed to help farmers rather than rich people who are car owners. You're not supposed to provide so-called subsidy, though it is not subsidy, but difference in lower tax on diesel to very well-off people. Most of the diesel car owners are very well-off people. So even that kind of policy, which is helping rich people, well-off people. So the kind of problem which you face because of pollution, both local as well as global pollution, if people are aware, they would accept the policy changes which would mitigate the pollution. Okay, so awareness of people is obviously required. Thank you very much.
Thanks.